I thank you for having me. My friend Brenda Connolly and I go all the way back to swimming in 1982 for Coconut Creek High School. With a name like that, it's a wonder we learned anything. Turns out Brenda went on to USF and swam on the same team as my husband when he was a freshman. Rob, that's my husband, and I met later at UCF and married after graduation. Lately, we hear a lot about building tribes. I found Brenda on Facebook and learned that she teaches organic farming to autistic children. So here I am talking with you, my type of people from my type of tribe. Back then, I was part of the swimming tribe. Swimming is a sport that consumes you. It's like autism. Most people don't get it unless they've been thrown in and hollered at to paddle, unless they've plunged its depths. My husband would add here, I've been told I volunteered. You're up before dawn, practicing in a cold pool. It has a lonely, sensory feel to it. Imagine the sound of a diving bell. You're a chamber, submerging. The sounds are muffled, but acute within your own eardrum. It's just you underwater, conserving your breath, living within the confines of your own thoughts. You swim or stim, lap after lap, lapping and overlapping the thousands of yards that you swam the day before. You stare at a black line that is also continuous. There is something autistic about that. It is what separates the swimmers from the non-swimmers. Even now where I live, people don't get swimming. We live in the rural mountains of North Carolina. They think that swimming is floating around on a raft in a lake with a beer. We've lived there now going on 18 years. For most of my son Paul's schooling years, he was the only one labeled as autistic. Thankfully now people are starting to understand. My son Paul was born in 1990. I like to say that he was autistic before it was cool. Before 1990, and you know the statistic, it was 1 in every 10,000 born on the spectrum. We made the cut, I guess. Paul is the oldest of our 6 children. When a person asks, "You have 6?" my husband deftly answers, "No, they have us." Paul was a stressed out infant. He had crying spells in the afternoon. Changed, fed, rocked, it didn't matter. He'd start howling, crying, beet-faced, like he had colic. But this wasn't colic. He wouldn't outgrow it, the underlying virtue. The behavior would just morph into something else. I'd place him in our bed face down between 2 pillows so he wouldn't roll off, and I'd walk out to the kitchen to start dinner. And every few minutes I'd come back in to check on him, pat his back, coo in his ear, let him know I was there. I don't think he heard me. Finally, after about 40 minutes, the crying stopped. I'd walk back in, and Paul would be all bowed up, his back arched, still howling, sweat pooled under his eyes, red in the face with his little mouth wide open, but there was no sound because he'd lost his voice. Now I'm supposed to rub the top of my mouth with my tongue so I don't start crying. I'd peel off his sleeper and he'd gradually settle into my arms, exhausted and passive. This went on for a few months. Paul was a real mix as a toddler. On the one hand, he was docile and pensive. But if the TV screen messed up with static, he'd start clawing at his face. Noises upset him. New clothing was either scratchy or the colors too vivid. He was sick a lot with ear infections. There was always a bottle of antibiotics sitting on the kitchen windowsill. He was a loner and happy to be that way. I found it odd that he'd do the echolalia thing, repeating the last word of a sentence over and over again. Of course, I didn't know the word echolalia. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it correctly tonight. I didn't know the word autism. I thought you either had it or you didn't, like the movie Rain Man. But then Christmas came when Paul was almost 5 years old. We now had 3 boys, 2 bicycles with training wheels, a pirate ship, swords, cowboy guns, candy canes, Santa, and baby Jesus. It was a very stimulating affair. Paul was fully engaged. He was interactive, saying things like, 2 bikes, Scotty got a bike too. It was thrilling to see him so with it. But then the day after Christmas, he didn't speak. He didn't say one word for 3 days. He had this vacant look, as if he were blind and deaf. It was terrifying. I began homeschooling because I knew Paul wasn't ready for school, the kind of getting on the yellow bus, sitting at a desk, or walking in single file lines type of school. I checked out the one book on autism that I found at the library. I consoled myself that he didn't have autism because he wasn't climbing on our roof, chewing on gravel, or having seizures, wasn't playing with a fuzzball in the corner. Paul was affectionate and verbal sometimes, and I was relieved. I saw an article in the lifestyle section of the paper. This was in the Virginian Pilot in Virginia Beach area at the time, about a single mother and her son who was severely autistic. He was nonverbal. The article went into their typical day. The mom looked exhausted. The boy looked absent. I also remember about the same time, and I think it might even have been in the article, reading that parents of autistic children experience depression more acutely than parents with a terminally ill child. It scared me, and little did I realize that we were experiencing a lesser version of it ourselves. We moved across town, then things got weird. My husband worked long hours. The move was a huge change for our son Paul. Histrionic. He became more allergic and developed asthma. His speech broke off into pieces, like a jigsaw puzzle. Some words he couldn't pronounce, like around Christmas time when he was a little more engaged. We made a paper advent chain, and he'd say, "Advent change." He'd say this while scratching his itchy allergic nose and struggled with smiling naturally for the camera, his teeth grown in crooked with a pronounced overbite. He spoke in third person. Instead of saying, "I played on the swing set," or whatever, he'd say, "Paul did that." Our homeschooling stalled, and he wasn't reading yet at 6 years old. He was more reclusive and less interested in playing with his brothers. I noticed that his large motor skills seemed to slow down. It was as if he moved to the rhythm of his own dreamy world. Everything was harder for Paul. When our kids all broke out with chicken pox, Paul got them last and the worst. Pox everywhere, inside and outside. Then, one day, I smelled a wiry smoke, and the lamp wouldn't work on his dresser. So I pulled it away and discovered that he'd urinated behind the dresser and almost caused a fire in the outlet. And he'd been urinating down the AC vents in the floor as well. And we had to pull up the carpet. And then he started playing with his feces. Without being a spoiler, Kim Stagliano has a term for this, if you've read her book. And I'm very familiar with this term, by the way. Even as recently as a year ago, when Paul was 25, he regressed in toilet habits when we had my blind mother-in-law living with us and I was her caregiver. Paul is often our gauge when crisis strikes our family. Back to when Paul was about 6. By this point, with all of Paul's behavior and the load I carried being pregnant with our 5th child, I lost it. Pretty much a straight up nervous breakdown. I say straight up because there was no time to sit up or lie down. That is when I started praying the rosary. I was drowning in motherhood, which is saying a lot when you've been a lifeguard and a competitive swimmer. The rosary, prayer itself, became my tow rope back to sanity. Let's skip to a time when Rob and I were in New York for a trade show, the New York Toy Fair that we go to every year in February. Paul was about 20 years old. He was home with my mom, his brothers, and his sisters. I got a call on my cell at 5 in the morning, and he was upset, his voice shaking, his words fragmented. I was just only thinking of a time, cross country. Somebody beat me at that race. I made a mistake. I might have just only punched my fist in the wall enough to make a hole. I asked him, "Did you hurt your hand?" "Half." Rob, my husband, could hear Paul. He grumbled and rolled over and said, "Tell him don't worry, we'll fix it when we get home." You know how it is when your kid is autistic. You feel like all the air is being sucked out of the room and you can't breathe because you don't know what to do. I'm sure you've seen that lady on the YouTube video. Her son is around 13. Some of you have. He's taller than she is. He's nonverbal. She and her husband tag team it when their son becomes physical, having a tantrum. She wrangles her son to the floor, pins his arms behind his head. Her husband has got him at the ankles, and they're resigned. They calm him down. And the mom, at the end of the episode, makes the point, this is what autism looks like. People need to know. Personally, I don't care what you do to help your kid. Suzuki violin lessons, gluten and dairy-free diets, applied behavior analysis, essential oils, whatever. I don't care if you stand on your head. I applaud you. I get it. I've tried it all too. So what could I do in that New York hotel room with my son being so far away, upset, with a hole in the wall? We prayed the rosary over the phone. One Hail Mary after another. The repetition of it, the contemplative nature of it calmed us both. It's rather autistic, kind of like stimming. It's also like swimming laps. Each lap counts, and each prayer counts. The discipline that swimming requires, the discipline that parenting an autistic child requires, the discipline that autism itself requires of your child most of all, when you think about what they have to do to hold it together. The one girl that we've seen, she can only communicate through the computer, and she rocks violently, and she said she does that so that she doesn't pull all the clothes out of her dresser. I offer to you that the rosary is true meditation. We Audi parents cycle between a process of plunging into the abyss of reality, deeper into the abyss of denial at times, but then we surface for that precious air of mercy and acceptance. It is in the truth of love that we carry on. For me, this is where I have to dwell, where I tread water and where I'm able to keep swimming. I get it. that you be kind to yourself and find what works for you and your child. Nurture a hobby. Find a creative outlet. One of my friends is a belly dancer. Another is a mountain biker. My new friend Kim practices martial arts and bakes. I'm a crafter. I dance in my kitchen. I play my music really loud in the car. And when I'm really in a fix, I play my music really loud and clean the house. Most of all, I pray. But whatever your 12-step program is, acknowledging that you can't do it on your own, that you need to rely on a higher power, use it. Reach for mercy, because that is what will keep your head above water.